In this week's news roundup, the former chief software officer of the US Defense Department declares that China has won the race for AI supremacy and is assured of future world domination. The world continues to grapple with the energy crisis, confronting leaders with the choices they'd hoped to avoid, and Google announces a crackdown on YouTube content that denies the reality of climate change. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. According to many analysts, whichever of the US and China achieves dominance in artificial intelligence will determine who ultimately becomes the dominant world power. Well, according to the US Department of Defense former chief software officer, the race is already over and China has won hands down. Nicholas Challen quit his post in protest in September because he said the US military is too slow to compete and his ability to change this was not being supported. He told the Financial Times that it was just a matter of time before Beijing achieves global dominance. We have no fighting chance against China in 15 to 20 years. Right now, it's already a done deal. It is already over, in my opinion. As I covered in my recent deep dive video on the topic, AI and cyber warfare will play a much bigger role in future conflicts. Challen dismissed the US cyber defense measures as being presently at kindergarten level. In his resignation letter, he noted that his office was left unempowered even to fix basic IT issues, and he observed that military figures with no technical experience were constantly being put in charge of IT projects, setting up critical infrastructure to fail. The DoD should stop pretending they want industry folks to come and help if they are not going to let them do the work. While we wasted time in bureaucracy, our adversaries moved further ahead. He also argued that companies like Google were doing the country a disservice by refusing to work with the military more on AI, displaying ethical niceties that don't trouble their Chinese counterparts. Now, this isn't entirely news. Earlier this year, the National Security Commission on AI, chaired by former Google chief executive Eric Schmidt, said that it believed that China was poised to become the world's first AI superpower. In 2015, an open letter signed by thousands of scientists, as well as figures like Elon Musk and Jack Dorsey and the late Stephen Hawking, described autonomous weapons as the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear arms. And it made this prediction: if any major military power pushes ahead with AI weapon development, a global arms race is virtually inevitable. And the endpoint of this technological trajectory is obvious: autonomous weapons will become the Kalashnikovs of tomorrow. In other words, tools for dictators and terrorists, not just superpowers. But just 6 years later, it's clear that the arms race is already underway. Whether the predicted endpoint is truly inevitable remains to be seen. Hence the ethics question that has been fiercely debated over the last decade as to whether AI systems become empowered as autonomous attack systems, with an algorithm making decisions about selecting and attacking human beings. The US position is that it should not. Humans must always be in the loop. Meanwhile, reportedly China's view is that it's working towards a singularity, where AI technology deployed on the battlefield means that events progress and decisions are made faster than human participants can follow or even comprehend. Does that knowledge force the US and its allies to match the brief? In the same way that the first use of nuclear weapons, something that would be one of the most unethical acts in history if ever actually carried out, had to be the country's policy and position if nuclear deterrence was to work. So it could be here. If American AI is required to operate to a more humane or risk-averse level, it could mean that the mismatch in capabilities would be too great. Some have argued for a global ban on autonomous weapons. Others have countered that China and Russia would not abide by such an agreement, and it would be hard in any case to enforce. Is the situation as straightforward and gloomy as Nicholas Challen presents? Well, it's always risky to judge a complex system by just one aspect. After all, the US remains currently the most powerful military force in the world, and yet has just retreated from Afghanistan in less than glorious form. There are always more factors involved. And China has many problems, not just advantages. It has a looming economic crisis as its hugely indebted property market is going through a major clash with economic reality. It's conducting an unprecedented experiment with using more and more of its AI in ways to control its own population, even as its economic progress has created a significant middle class, which you might think is going to become less compliant over time. So far, every authoritarian government has sown the seeds of its own downfall, sometimes over a long time scale, but nevertheless inevitably. Now, the Chinese government is the most credible contender as an exception to the rule, but the odds that they'll fail over the coming decades remains a real possibility. And particularly when you look at the difficulties they face in meeting the objective of becoming economically dominant. Recent government policy initiatives to encourage stronger population growth, to provide the workers needed for a thriving economy, those have not been successful. Having suppressed population growth with the disastrous one-child policy, it's now finding it can't just turn the taps back on. So this week, a survey found that more than 4 in 10 young urban Chinese women said that they wanted to remain single. The authors of the survey, writing in a state-run newspaper, said that the delay in marrying and the low desire to get married have become a hidden concern for the entire society. According to the census data, China's population grew more slowly last year than in the last decade, and births are expected to fall again this year. A key reason given by young people why they didn't want to marry and have children was the exorbitant costs of raising a child. Although that was supplemented by the fact that nearly 3/4 of Chinese women said they just didn't believe in marriage thanks to personal experiences of abuse. So while it seems a high probability that China will develop superior battlefield weapons over the next coming decades, whether that will ultimately be the most important factor in its ability to rise to global superpower dominance, that still remains to be seen. Right now, you wouldn't bet against them, largely because of the current disarray of the West. But it's by no means as simple as it might seem to someone who's sat in one specific place within the Department of Defense. While all that's been going on, there's still a global energy crisis, and a number of leaders are being forced into contemplating measures they would have preferred to avoid. We'll come to that in just a minute. But first, because of that energy crisis, we're all hoping we might get a mild winter this year. Indeed, the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, has told energy bosses that this is the big hope to avoid even higher energy bills. It tells you a lot when keeping your fingers crossed for good weather becomes official government policy. Well, stories have been circulating this week to suggest that might be wishful thinking. The same phenomenon that gave us the freezing temperatures in Texas earlier this year might be about to happen again, right as we're even on the approach towards winter. Or as some newspaper journalists are putting it, in glorious ignorance of how this all works, another polar vortex is coming. And yes, some people suggest that in the counterintuitive climate world in which we live, climate change could be making such extreme cold episodes more frequent. Which is just weird, right? I mean, how can global warming mean that you get freezing temperatures? Well, we'll be looking at the recent research that has updated our thinking on how all of this works, and we'll be checking out what really might be about to happen and what it would mean for the winter. And of course, we'll be asking the question, is climate change really making such events more frequent? That's what I'm going to be talking about in the Monday Deep Dive video, going live on this channel at 7 PM UK time, Monday next week. Join me for that. Meanwhile, the shockwaves of the worldwide energy crisis have made a lot of people very focused in the absence of obvious and easy short-term fixes on finding people to blame that aren't themselves. Whereas a number of governments could be said to have made highly unfortunate energy choices over the last decade, all of them are mostly finding other places to point the finger. In Europe, they mostly want to blame Putin and Russia's nationalised oil company Gazprom. They can't go wholly overboard with that because they're really rather hoping that Russia will agree to increase the flow of oil. President Putin again criticised European countries this week for having given up long-term gas supply contracts, amongst other mistakes. And he insisted that Russia would be delighted to up the gas supply to let Europe have as much gas as it could possibly need. But by the way, that pipeline across Ukraine is a bit old and under-maintained, and if Russia boosted the flow there, well, it could blow the whole thing out. And then there'd be no gas at all. But luckily, there's this brand new pipeline, Nord Stream 2, that's just been built, and as soon as Europe approves it, the quantity of gas coming through will be plentiful. Well, Europe hasn't got a leg to stand on because, as I noted last week, Russia is fulfilling existing contractual requirements. Meanwhile, the energy crisis is also sharpening internal European politics in the quest for better future choices. Specifically, President Macron is taking his chance to build a pro-nuclear alliance to try to break through German opposition. 9 other European countries have signed up to push for nuclear power to be classified as green technology by the EU, which would allow for climate change subsidies to be directed towards its expansion. Germany, which has been the leading and most influential single nation at the heart of Europe, has been dead set against nuclear. Since the Fukushima tsunami, it has been dismantling its own nuclear industry, with the consequence, of course, of increasing fossil fuel use in the short term. France, of course, is the nation that has the highest percentage of its power produced by nuclear, and earlier this week it announced major investments in small modular reactors for the future. A statement has been released, signed by Bulgaria, Croatia, Czechia, Finland, France, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Slovakia and Slovenia, saying this: there is no science-based evidence that nuclear power is less climate-friendly than any low-carbon or renewable energy sources. We need nuclear energy. This is for all of us a key and only means for a low-carbon future. Right now, nuclear makes up about a quarter of the EU's electricity generation and fully about half of all the low-carbon generation. Countries lined up alongside Germany in opposing this includes Austria, Ireland and Italy. But the energy crunch is kind of pushing things in France's direction. And if you add to that the decline of wind speeds across northern Europe, possibly due to global stilling, which I discussed in Monday's video by the way, it's hard to see how long the push can be resisted. Meanwhile, elsewhere, others are taking other measures to try to resolve the problem in the short term. So in the US, President Joe Biden has, shall we say, startled environmentalists.
How dare you!
By consulting with the oil industry to find a remedy to rising gasoline prices, which have been going up fast. The average gallon price of gas has reached $3.28, more than $1 above this time last year. Now, Europeans and particularly Brits would probably look at that and reflect on how amazingly cheap it is. But as always, it comes down to what you're used to. For the US, the energy costs have been affected by some of the same factors as everywhere else. China's high energy demand, for instance, and its determination to get what it needs at any cost, thereby pushing prices up. You can add to that the fact that oil companies that were hit hard by plunging demand during the height of the pandemic have been slow to develop new wells, and OPEC is likewise being cautious about how fast it ramps up supply. Biden has requested OPEC increase its exports in the absence of any other mechanisms to try to bring those prices down. Meanwhile, in the UK, policy continues to rather thrash about in an uncoordinated way. As gas prices have shot up higher here than almost anywhere else, this week the government confirmed its intention to announce new levies on gas bills to fund low-carbon heating. Seriously, businesses are going bust because of the cost of energy. It's beyond anything they can deal with, and the UK government is going to go ahead at this moment with measures to increase costs. Speaking as someone who supports the goal of net zero, I have to ask, what? Why? I mean, what the hell? One government source was reported as agreeing that the plans were madness and that Downing Street was failing to appreciate the reality of the problem we're facing with energy prices. No kidding! And this is exactly why I've said that regardless of whether you support net zero or not, there needs to be political opposition that can challenge incompetent and badly thought through policies. And since that isn't being provided by the opposition parties, all of which simply say the government should be doing what it's doing but a bit faster and a bit further, then it falls to those who actually oppose net zero to provide that opposition. So this week, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, who I carefully gave specific and limited praise last week for providing such opposition, they've clearly been absorbing all of this into their organisational strategy since this week they rebranded as Net Zero Watch. Personally, I think that's a very smart move on their part. Climate scientists and campaigners were predictably dismissive about the move, and I get it. But opposition is essential in a democracy. Doesn't mean that people love that opposition anymore. But the energy crisis we're in right now has demonstrated that if you implement policies badly, you end up with some pretty appalling consequences. So yes, we need it. The open question is how much freedom they're going to get to provide that challenge on public policy. And I ask that because this week Google announced that YouTube would demonetize videos that deny climate change. The latest, but surely not the last, ratchet up of the pressure on wrongthink. It said that it had increasingly heard from advertisers who didn't want their ads appearing alongside content that contradicts well-established scientific consensus around the existence and causes of climate change. And fair enough. And I think advertisers should be able to control where their adverts appear. Although this isn't about advertisers choosing, of course, because YouTube will simply decide on their behalf. And that's where the questions come up. YouTube routinely gets overzealous about demonetizing videos that deal with sensitive topical content. So how finally is it going to draw the line between legitimate political debate around the merit or otherwise of policy actions taken on climate change and discussions on the actual science? I mean, based on their definition, this channel should have no problems at the moment, notwithstanding the potential for new issues or controversies in the future. If I've done a video saying that the likelihood of catastrophic tipping points are not strongly supported by the IPCC, does that pass muster? Well, probably it does. What about if someone makes the same point but doesn't reference the IPCC? They just say, although some scientists say this is a thing, I say it probably isn't. Will YouTube know enough not to hit that? Will it relent if its algorithm acts and then it gets challenged? Or will it be like the quizzes that take place in my village, where the quizmaster is always right, even when you can clearly show that he's wrong? With various climate scientists attacking the Net Zero Watch initiative as being climate denial, with them making no distinction between policy debate and science misrepresentation, you might not be entirely confident that this is going to play out well. Now, in a minute, we'll get to a few other headlines for the week, including the new WHO move on the origin of COVID-19 and the huge public embarrassment for the extreme climate campaigners from Insulate Britain. All that to come. But first, it's time for another Q&A video. Patreon supporters get first priority for questions, as they're the ones who keep this channel going. But if you have a question about something you'd like to see discussed here, please add it to the comments below. To make sure that I see it, start your question with the word question in all caps. The more interesting your question is to a wider audience, the more likely it will make it in. I try to answer as many as I can, so do pitch in if there's something you'd like to discuss. Then that video will be going live next Wednesday at 7 p.m. UK time. Join me for that. A few other quick news headlines from this week. The World Health Organization has announced its new scientific advisory group to look at the origin of COVID-19. It was launched with a joint editorial in the journal Science by the WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus and two others. There he said, a lab accident cannot be ruled out until there is sufficient evidence to do so and those results are openly shared. The new group is made up of 26 scientists from around the world, including several with involvement in inspecting high-security labs. Just minutes before the WHO announcement, China declared that it would analyse up to 200,000 blood samples from 2019 for traces of COVID. This move was something that had long been requested by the WHO since it could give clues into early emergence from date and location. Which sounds great. But there's a huge but, which is that China has said that it will do the analysis and it will not allow foreign scientists to see the data for themselves. But that's okay because we trust them completely, right? The extreme climate campaigners Insulate Britain announced yesterday that they were going to pause their road blocking campaign until COP26. Video has been circulating on social media of increasingly frustrated drivers physically, although not that I've seen violently, hauling them out of the roads and expressing their anger for them bringing traffic to a standstill. The original plan for the group was to get hundreds of them thrown into prison in time for COP26, which in their minds would prove to be a major embarrassment for the government. I'm not sure they weren't overinflating their own importance in that scenario, but in any case, the actual embarrassment for the government turned out to be the inadequacy of the current laws and their enforcement to actually even achieve that goal in the short term. I can only speculate that this change now is because they've shifted strategy, and I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't hopeful of creating similar chaos and disturbance actually at the COP26 summit itself. Or it could just be from embarrassment when it was accidentally shared on social media just how damaged they'd been by one of their lead spokespeople being revealed to have not actually have bothered to insulate his own home. Two protesters, believing they were sending direct messages but in reality openly tweeting, had this exchange. Have you raised enough money to get Liam's house insulated yet? Hi Wes, no, we're about 4k short. I wouldn't say this publicly, and yet. But this has been a PR disaster for us. Why did he tell us that his house was insulated at the start and it now turns out that his is the only one without insulation? He's being really weird with us too. Chat later about it. How they all laughed, I expect, when the highly popular Guido Fawkes website shared it for all to see. What standards do you hold yourself to? Really? Over the last couple of COVID years, the UK education system has been subject to some of the worst decisions I've seen. Although they're really just building on top of a trend that had been building for several decades. They didn't run proper exams, they had teachers projecting results, leading to extraordinary grade inflation and a cohort of youngsters with minimal valuable information to pass on to others about their educational level or their talents and abilities. But this was the final straw. Grade inflation had been creeping for decades as institutions followed the incentives to improve their performance, which they did by asking easier questions. Well, guess what? When systems are broken like that, it shows in the way that people sidestep those systems to get what they want anyway. So we found out this week that businesses in the UK have lost faith in the exam system and they're now using their own assessments of recruits. About 1 in 7 completely ignores exam and degree results, treating them as worthless. And fair enough. The University Watchdog has warned about falling standards in basic literacy, with many higher education establishments now, in the name of diversity, relaxing previous standards on bad spelling and grammar. This vision of inclusivity, so that you lower standards to meet the poorest performers, is how you slip from a high-skill, high-performance economy to an incompetent and victim economy. Why has it been that in the past, well-off, successful parents most often raised children who went on to become high-performing, successful young people? Because they understood how you succeed. So they made sure that their children put in the work, held themselves to high standards, and expected the best of themselves. Now, if you have a similar ambition for your children, or even at whatever age you're trying to do this for yourself, you have to overcome institutional norms rather than embrace them. You have to find ways to set those high standards for yourself, and either hold yourself accountable to them or find a like-minded friend or a mentor to do it for you. Can you still be successful if you're surrounded by a decaying set of institutional norms? Maybe. Only if you're clear about how to escape the dragging effect that they will have on you. Can you be your best self while interacting, for instance, with social media that rewards people who drift to the lowest forms of discourse? Sure you can. Just identify the factors that make it harder and deal with them. For instance, if you find yourself communicating in mean-minded ways because you're anonymous on YouTube and you can say what you like in the comment section without consequence or embarrassment. Well, here's the thing. Change your handle to your actual name. Put your actual photo on it. Try it. See if it changes how you see yourself, whether you do more things you're proud to put your name to rather than things in which you take a kind of mean pleasure at the time, but ultimately, probably makes you feel less like the person you would aspire to be. Whatever this looks like for you, there are more people out there who care about doing the best they can. Like attracts like. If you do more of that, you attract the company of others who do the same. When you surround yourself with success, some of it rubs off on you. We don't have choice about the world and the environment in which we find ourselves. We always have a choice about how we respond to it. All right. I didn't quite manage my own standard this week. Hence, there was no video on Wednesday. Producing 3 videos per week is a push. And the truth is, I still have to do some regular bits of client work in order to make ends meet. When the channel was growing strongly, I thought maybe I'd get to the point where I could be full-time on here sooner rather than later and put all of that extra work in. But when YouTube slammed the brakes on in early March, as it did for a number of news-related channels, that all slowed right down. So if something happens in real life that requires a bit of time to deal with, or if a client wants something extra that week, then occasionally, and I try to keep it to a minimum, it can make it just impossible to do everything that I want. However, there's no doubt I couldn't do any of it without the support that I get from patrons. The time I can spend researching and producing videos, the freedom to continue making the sort of content that we want to talk about, even as YouTube is getting more and more picky about what will or won't pass its test for being monetized. All of that is purely the result of having that platform behind me. So if you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head along to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.